Hi guys, welcome to the ninth video of our series on Unit 3, America's Revolution in the Early Republic from 1754 to 1800. Okay, this is really the first of a kind of two-part series on 3.10, Shaping a New Republic. This one is a doozy. There is so much packed into it, I had to break it up into two videos. So we are going to get started. All right, so this first one, we're going to start by talking about a lot of the political institutions and the political parties that develop in the new United States. So, beginning with, how did early political institutions help stabilize the government and the economy of the new United States? So, let's look at a couple things. First of all, let's start by looking at the new government under George Washington. George Washington, of course, is the first president of the United States, and he does a number of things that kind of create precedents that other presidents follow years later to this day. So he started by creating executive departments of war, state, and justice. All right, we have a lot more departments today, but that's what George Washington started with: the Department of War, the Department of State, and the Department of Justice. Each one of those is headed by a secretary, and then he adds the Department of the Treasury as well. This is the first cabinet. Okay, you may have heard of the president's cabinet. The secretaries of state are the president's cabinet, the president's advisors. It is their job to advise the president on national and international matters. The first Secretary of State is Thomas Jefferson. He managed foreign affairs. Now, the Secretary of State is a really important role, and it's pretty interesting because George Washington chose two pretty different men to run the State Department and the Treasury Department. Thomas Jefferson was a Virginian planter. He was very agrarian. He saw the future of the United States as one made up of small yeoman farmers with small land plots and largely rural, with very limited control of the national government. Mostly everything would be controlled by state governments. And on the other hand, you have the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, who believes that the future of the country is largely industrial and manufacturing and urban. And he was also known as kind of an elitist. He believed that social stratification was necessary, healthy for a nation. And so he didn't want equality between social classes. He believed that moneyed men were the important ones for the running of the nation. And then, of course, you have Secretary of War Henry Knox and the Attorney General, also part of the cabinet, Edmund Randolph. Okay, so another thing that Washington does as president, one of the first bills he signs into law from the legislature is the Judiciary Act of 1789. And this, of course, establishes the federal court system. So this was really an important one as well to help establish the precedents of the new United States. Okay, so I want to get into Hamilton's financial plan. So you'll hear a lot about Hamilton's financial plan in the next few minutes. There was a lot packed into it, so there's quite a bit to go over. So facing the new nation are some pretty serious financial challenges. They have terrible war debt, a great deal of war debt, and unsurprisingly, those creditors wanted payment. I mean, at this point, we are looking at 7 or 8 years post-war, and trade was still pretty limited as well. So these are two major challenges that are facing the new United States. So Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, really steps up to this. He's really concerned about the lack of the public ability to gain credit. And he really desires, again, to move from an agricultural nation to one that has really increased manufacturing and industrialization. He wants to really expand the economy, expand the urban economy. So his financial plan had four really key points. He wanted to assume state debts, which we're going to talk more about in a second. He wanted to sell national bonds. He wanted to raise revenue through an excise tax and a whiskey tax, and that's going to cause some real controversy. And he also wanted to create a national bank of the United States. So state governments and national governments each had their own war debt. States usually owed money to their own citizens who had paid for the state militias. So their own wealthy citizens were the ones who they owed money to. So Hamilton wants to add the state debt to the U.S. national debt. And there were a couple issues with this, couple of reasons people are opposed with this. Basically, this involved him saying, okay, we're going to take all the creditors who are owed money by the states. We're going to go ahead and take those bonds that they have, essentially, and we're going to they're going to give them to us. We're going to buy them at face value and we'll replace them with national bonds. States who didn't owe a lot of money hated this plan. So the southern states owed very little money in terms of national debt. Unsurprisingly, they were able to pay back a lot of their debts because they had a great deal of financial resources because they did not pay for labor, right? The slave system and plantation system meant that they had a lot of extra money. So places like New England that were in very heavy debt and would benefit the most from this plan obviously supported it, but a lot of Southerners hated it. This is actually really smart, though, because the people who were owed money were the wealthy and powerful of those states. So if they wanted a chance to get their money back, the U.S. needed to survive. So he really did a good job at tying together the interests of the citizens, especially the wealthy, powerful citizens, to the success of the American government, basically saying, hey, if we assume these states' debts, then now the U.S. government is the one who has to pay back the creditors. So now the creditors actively want the U.S. government to survive for their own financial interests. So this is actually really smart. Okay, another part of Hamilton's financial plan was the sale of national bonds. A bond, if you do not know, is essentially an IOU. It's basically a slip of paper that you buy from the government that says, hey, we're going to pay you back this original amount to the owner of the bond, plus the interest accrued on it at a later date. A lot of things are funded this way. It's pretty common to fund wars this way. But his plan was to sell these bonds in order to fund the Treasury Department and then eventually the National Bank. And finally, they also had another way to raise money was an excise tax and a whiskey tax. So an excise tax was mostly a tax on luxury items, whiskey in particular. This was also going to help fund the Treasury and going into the Treasury. And once these taxes were implemented, there was enough money to begin making payments on the debt, which is really, really important. A tariff or an excise tax is a tax on imported goods. So foreign goods basically became more expensive. So, we have two kind of separate taxes here. We have the luxury item tax like whiskey, which is more domestic. And then we have a tariff or an excise tax on goods that are coming in that are being imported into the country from elsewhere. This, by the way, is really going to help to further annoy Southerners because the South had a lot less manufacturing even at this time than did New England or the Middle Colonies, what was the Middle Colonies. So Southern states were particularly enraged over this because they bought a lot of foreign products because they didn't have much of their own manufacturing. They were mostly agricultural. So that meant that they were the ones who were really paying these excise taxes the most. So this really upset them. And we are going to talk a lot more about their anger over excise taxes in the 19th century. Okay, so the other big thing was that Hamilton really wanted to establish a national bank in order to help unify the states and improve credit. This national bank would be able to print paper money. It would be able to collect tax revenue. Basically, it provided a place for federal funds to go. It would be able to pay interest on debt. And this is really key, it could offer commercial loans for new businesses and industry. So it would bring money in from taxes and bonds and tariffs, and then that money could go back out of the national bank as interest payments and loans for businesses. Loans are really important because they encourage wealth creation. They allow people to create businesses, which then generate more wealth. They help grow the GDP, the gross domestic product, means we can create more things. More property and tax revenue streams appear, and those are taxable. And that increases the wealth of the nation and reduces the stagnancy of the economy. So this is actually a really good plan, which allowed the national government to then borrow from other countries. And then states would also now be more dependent upon the federal government. So there were definitely people who opposed this plan. And the biggest thing they said, the opponents argue that nothing in the Constitution gave the central government the power to make a national bank. That was the primary argument of people like Jefferson and his supporters who wanted a really small federal government, the people who were originally those anti-federalists during the ratification debate. They said, look, the central government only has a few specific enumerated powers, which you may recall from our last conversation in the last video about the Constitution. The federal government is only supposed to have some very specific listed enumerated powers in the Constitution. They're not supposed to be doing anything else. And a national bank is certainly not listed in the Constitution. Now, Hamilton uses what's called the elastic clause to argue against this. He argues that according to the elastic clause, the government, according to the Constitution, has the right and the power to make any laws that are, quote, necessary and proper for carrying out the enumerated powers. So those listed powers, the Constitution also says, hey, if the government has to make additional laws to carry out these powers, they're allowed to do that. So even if it doesn't explicitly state that the national bank can be created by the Constitution, Hamilton argues that it's covered under the Elastic Clause, that you need a national bank to handle U.S. finances, that creation of a national bank by the federal government is, in fact, necessary and proper. So in spite of not being an enumerated cause of power, he says it's implied because of the Elastic Clause. And this actually works, okay? He works. He gets his charter. He gets his bank with a 20-year charter. The national bank functions exactly as Hamilton says it will. It stabilizes the economy. It allows for payments on debt to begin to occur. It allows the national government to borrow money and to make loans to help grow the economy. And it also really increased, as Hamilton wished, the emphasis on industry and manufacturing. Hamilton loved it. Jefferson and his cronies hated it. So the other kind of side effect here is we really are going to start to see the development of opposing factions in the national government to start to form into political parties. So that leads us to how and why did political factions emerge in the national government? Okay, so this really has its roots in the idea of constitutional interpretation. So how does one interpret the Constitution? So Hamilton's interpretation of the Elastic Clause brings up a debate that we'll see again and again and again in U.S. history. I mean, it is literally the main source of contention in political parties today. How tightly should we stick to the Constitution? How should we interpret the Constitution? How much power does the federal government really have as opposed to state governments? I mean, it is still the big divide between today's modern party of Democrats and Republicans is this argument over how big should government be. Okay, so there's two ideas of how you might interpret the Constitution. Strict constructionists, people who are strict constructionists of the Constitution, say that only what is specifically listed in the Constitution, enumerated powers, that is all that the federal government, the national government, is allowed to do, nothing more. Okay, this is going to be Thomas Jefferson and his friends. Okay, loose constructionists are going to argue that additional powers are not only needed, but they are allowed because of the necessary and proper clause, the Elastic Clause we just referred to. These are known as implied powers. So Hamilton says, okay, these are implied powers. They may not be enumerated, but the Constitution implies that they are allowed, so the federal government can have more powers beyond what is simply enumerated in the Constitution. And like I said, this is, of course, going to be Alexander Hamilton's argument and the people who agree with him. So this is the emergence of our early parties, okay? This is definitely going to be caused by the domestic challenges we just discussed, like the National Bank, but other domestic challenges too, the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Whiskey Rebellion, and then some international challenges as well, like the French Revolution, the Jay's Treaty, Pinckney Treaty. We're actually going to talk all about those in the next video. But what you really need to know now is all of these domestic and international challenges are really going to help further codify this divide between these two different main factions who really did not agree on how to handle all these new challenges. So the emergence of the two-party political system in the United States really has its roots in the Federalist and anti-Federalist divide that we talked about in the last video over the ratification of the Constitution. So the Federalists, led by Hamilton, were proponents of very strong central government. They were favored by the urban dwellers and definitely elite interests, the interests of the wealthy, whereas the Democratic Republicans, and those would have been many of those former anti-Federalists, Democratic Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And don't get confused, the Democratic Republican Party is not related to either the Democrat or the Republican Party today. Okay, so they're not the same thing. There are definitely some party changes that this party will undergo significant changes. So don't relate it in your mind to either today's Democratic Party or today's Republican Party. So the Democratic Republicans are going to champion states' rights and say, no, the federal government has very limited powers and the state government should be in charge of most of it. And they favored rural and agricultural interests. So you can definitely see why a lot of southern states are going to be Democratic Republican. Okay, they're going to want to be worried about their own state-specific interests that they felt were not being served by those like Hamilton that had very urban interests. So they're really going to favor these more rural and agricultural interests. Okay, so this is a little chart. I think it's just kind of convenient to take a look at. Feel free to pause it, take a look. It mostly just summarizes what I just said in a little bit more of a clear sort of graphic organizer type fashion. Okay, but feel free to pause this, take a look at it. It really lays out some of the key ideas of the early parties. And that's all for today. We're going to go on to our next one in the next video, talking about the rest of the early challenges faced by the Republic.